So I want to incorporate starship battles into my fantasy game, and I want the characters to be like the starship captain. Basically, I want the Enterprise D to be flying around in a fantasy world, and I want the Klingons to be like, say, orcs, and I want Captain Picard to be a bard because I think that's what he should be, and I think it's going to be great. What do you think? Hello and welcome to this episode of How to Be a Great GM. My name is Guy, and today we're looking at adding cool stuff. Who doesn't want to add cool stuff to their game? But how exactly do we go about doing it? And are there any tricks or ways in which we can do it so that it comes across as cool and not just like we stole the idea and don't have much imagination ourselves? It takes a little bit of imagination to adapt anything from anything to anything else, but it can be done, and it can sometimes be done to great effect. So it really is a skill that's worthwhile developing. We're going to use four different steps, I suppose you could say, to do this. We're going to identify just what it is that's cool about the concept we want to add to our game. We're going to adapt it, we're going to stat it, and then we're going to seed it, or we're going to include it in our game. So I'm also talking about taking cool things and adding it into a game that already exists and doing it in such a way that it feels as if it was just always there, that players just didn't realize it or weren't part of it. So that's the process we're going to take. Let's go. Now, when we talk about identifying stuff, what do we mean? Well, is it something that's going to last for a long time in your campaign? Is it something that you really need to worry about? Or is it something that's just going to happen once or twice and then be forgotten about? If it's going to happen once or twice and not really have too much of an impact on the game, it's just something that's fun, then absolutely go ahead and don't think about it too much. Add it in, have some fun, and then move on. On the other hand, if it is something that's going to be long term, if it's going to be something that the PCs can interact with over a long time, if it's going to be something that reoccurs regularly in your game, then you need to start thinking about it. You need to start understanding what it is in terms of long impact it's going to have on your game world. For example, if we take the idea of the Stargate is a really cool idea from the Stargate Universe series. That's the TV series of Stargate, Stargate SG-1, Stargate the movie, Stargate Universe, Stargate Atlantis, all of those kinds of things. Stargate Origins, I think, was the last one. So there's lots and lots and lots of stuff of Stargate. Stargate's a cool idea, and the whole idea is that there's a portal from one world to another. Let's say you want to add that into your own world, and you kind of want to adapt it. Well, is it long-lasting? Yes, it is. You're creating portals all over your world. Why haven't they been used before? It's a good question. Why and what are they going to be used for in the future, and who will have access to them? Again, good questions. The main one is, why hasn't it been used before? Perhaps it just hasn't been accessible. Perhaps they were inert and now they've become active. That would be an interesting mystery. Why are they suddenly all working now? What caused them to start working? Those are some very, very interesting adventures that are prompted by deciding on whether it's long-lasting or not. Does it add value? If the cool idea, let's say adding a starship to a fantasy game, is it a cool idea for the players to have all this modern-day technology or futuristic technology at their fingertips? Maybe not. Is it an idea to try and build a flying ship that allows them to basically do what you would do in a science fiction starship-based game, but you're now in a fantasy game? Well, that might work. It could add value. You need to think about mechanics and things. We're getting there, but it could be quite fun. So yes, it adds value. If it doesn't add any value, if it's just a random thing and it's long-lasting, but, well, it really doesn't do much to the actual game itself, is it worth adding in the first place? Is it thematic? Does it fit? Are you trying to perhaps add Dracula to a science fiction setting? Do you really want vampires in space? Well, it has been done, and quite successfully too, and it was adapted slightly, but was it thematic? It was borderline. It was borderline in terms of how that was done. So, thematic speaking, does it fit within the setting that you are basing your story in? If the answer is no, then I'm afraid that thing needs to be replaced. But you can always think around things. Vampires in space, well, what if they're not vampires? What if they're energy beings and they suck the life force out of other energy beings? That starts to become thematic since it's science fiction and it's energy beings. So perhaps that will work rather than the cold-blooded risen vampire. And instead of converting their minions into thralls, they convert them into energy-infested, mindless individuals. And the energy creatures sort of drive them remotely type of thing. So that could be an idea. Does that make it fun for your game? Is it going to break the immersion of your players to suddenly have Mary Poppins arrive in the middle of your wartime drama? That might not work unless your characters have been affected by a gas leak from a nearby secret base. Perhaps it would be a hard sell in my book. On the other hand, if you had this strong-willed woman who parachuted into the battlefield and arrived with medicine and was treating the troops, that's interesting. That's adding value, certainly if she has a positive disposition and if she has the ability to speak to animals. Well, now we start to enter into the slightly mystical, but not overly so. Something to think and keep in the back of your mind whilst doing this is, of course, does it add fun? If it adds fun, then it might be valuable. If it doesn't add fun, if it detracts from the fun, why are you adding it? That's something that you must always question. Is it long-lasting? Does it add value? Is it thematically appropriate? And is it fun? If it isn't thematically appropriate, how can you adjust it to be so? Is it fun? If it isn't fun, how can you adjust it to elicit fun? And the way that I test all of these things is I ask, what adventures are inspired by this thing arriving? So Mary Poppins arriving on the battlefield as she is, those adventures don't seem to fit with a World War II modern day setting. On the other hand, if you change it to a parachuting individual who is desperate to help the frontline troops, that now fits. If she gets captured by the enemy, I have adventures where my players have to go and rescue her. Perhaps she rescues the players' characters. There's all kinds of things that come out of it by just adjusting it accordingly to fit within my game thematically. So now, how do we adapt it? How do we go forward and make it our own? Well, firstly, you just make it your own. You decide upon elements that are cool. You decide upon the elements that you feel fit, and then you look for, well, what can I bring across? What can I convert? There was a wonderful exercise that we did on the live show the other day that I do. If you're not aware of those live shows, here's a little punt. 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time on Friday evenings is live GM sessions on YouTube where you can join me and ask your questions. One of the exercises we were doing was on adapting your mundane life, and I say mundane with the greatest of respect, your daily occupation. How do you convert it into a fantasy occupation? A YouTuber, for example, might be a bard who travels from town to town inspiring people. They may have created little arcanogram discs which project holograms of bards giving performances. Who knows? Well, that's one interpretation, and that's how you take a YouTuber and put them into a fantasy setting. Perhaps, and there were so many other options and suggestions that came through. If you spend a little bit of time thinking, you can see about how do you bring it in. So look for inspiration. How do we convert Mary Poppins into World War II? Well, there's definitely a lot of heroes from roughly that time period, a little bit later on, Amelia Earhart and the like. You've got Florence Nightingale from earlier. So you can bring all of these things together and find inspiration there. Look to your setting. Does your setting have something that might work? Perhaps if it's a fantasy thing, go to the Monsters Manual and see if you can find the equivalent. Look for a spell that does a similar kind of idea. Dimension Door, a permanent Dimension Door, might act very similar to a Stargate, especially if the other end of the Dimension Door isn't fixed. There are some risks that come with that, of course, and those are part of what we then have to expect. So what do we expect then when we have a starship in fantasy? Well, we expect to fly into strange nebula. We expect to be attacked by other flying ships, or ships that are similar in design. We expect to be boarded. We expect to have to carry cargo that changes into other things. So we add our expectations and we see how we can draw from what we expect to alter, to adjust, and to adapt the idea of cool, the thing that we think is cool, into our game to make it fit. So those are the things that we look at when we talk about adaptation. Then we stat it. Now, this doesn't have to be down into the minutiae, but you do need to work out the basic mechanics. How is it going to work? How long does it take to charge up? How far, how fast, how many, what tonnage? If it's some kind of magical device, if it's a wand of the Forget-Me from Men in Black, because you think that's cool, and the wizard has this wand that flashes a brilliant light causing everyone to forget. How many charges does it have? What's the saving throw against that sort of thing? Those are the kinds of things that you now stat out. It's important not to add just cool stuff and go, well, we'll figure it out on the fly. Establishing it beforehand means that you have thought about it, you've looked at it in terms of balance, you've looked at it in terms of limits. What are the limitations? If you have a dimension door Stargate type thing that you've placed into existence, does a wall of force act as an iris and prevent someone from walking through it? Or do they walk into the dimension door and then get lost in some kind of dimensional limbo? Is that what you want to have? Is that something that's fun? It could be. If they walk through it and then they just go splat on the other side against that wall of force, is that something that you want to have as a risk for your player characters? The bottom line is, when you are statting out all of the attributes of the cool thing that you've added, something to bear in mind is the value to the player characters. If the thing that you are adding has no value to the player characters, or has such a balance between it's useful but it's also dangerous, they're unlikely to use it. Their characters are already in a precarious world filled with monsters and adventures which are likely to kill their characters. They're not going to adopt anything, no matter how cool it is, if it runs the risk of killing them whilst they are using it. Cursed items are a different story. That's a punishment, that's a cursed item that has its own adventure. So if you create a dimensional doorway system and there is a very real risk, a very high risk that the player characters, when they use it, will end up as goo or trapped in a different dimension for an extended period of time, they might not use it. They might go, it's cool, but I'm going to take a horse. It's safer. Bear that in mind. It is something to think about. It has to have value to the PCs. Otherwise, why are you adding it, really? Let's think about that. The cool stuff is only cool if it gets used. Otherwise, it's a cool thing in a barn that no one gets to see. That's my thinking anyway. Then we need to set it up and we need to put it there and we need to establish it for our players. So we need to set it up. Is it something that happens before game? So you've thought about this, you're about to launch your campaign and you're adding it to your campaign world, in which case that's great. But this is the important thing. You have to tell your players about it so that they can keep that in their minds when they're creating a character. If there are dimensional doors everywhere that allow them to move around fairly freely and without too much risk, so there is value for them to use it, then mages might not want to focus on those kinds of spells. They can focus somewhere else. Perhaps they need to focus more on those kinds of spells because they need to do that. Perhaps warriors need to now think about looking at interdimensional armor, or depending on how it's going to be. So if it is something that is already in existence, then that's fine. Let your players know about it. If it is something new, if you decide, you know what, that wand of mind wiping is really cool, I want to add that to my game, you could have the characters either find it or build it. So either it's an ancient artifact that was forgotten about and has now been brought out into the light, in which case then it should be singular, there shouldn't be lots of them, or have the characters build it, they construct it and they design it over time and eventually it's ready for them to use. Again, it should be singular. So these are useful for cool things that are once-offs, but if there are lots of them, well, then definitely there should be an option that they were there already. How do we do that if we haven't established it? Well, like I said, throw in an adventure where the players are part of a convoy that discovers these ancient flying ships, 7 of them in an underground cavern, or they discover the blueprints for flying ships, if you want to add starships to your fantasy game. Perhaps it's more a case of the adventure, the artifact that they break causes the entire world to have dimensional fractures. It could be anything along those lines. You could use an adventure to bring it into your game if the adventure makes sense and kind of fits with what the players were doing. Don't rush to add in something that's cool. If the players work for it and at the end they're like, oh, that is so cool, then you've won. As far as winning is concerned, you've done it correctly. You could say that it's always been there and that the players just didn't really recognize it. I find that this is the weakest way of doing things. Oh, the Stargates have always been there. So why haven't we been using them for the last 6 months? You just thought you didn't want to use them. That doesn't cut the mustard, in my opinion. That just is wrong. It needs to be set up. It needs to be established that it was there beforehand. If it is something that you're adding in later on, find other ways of bringing it in rather than just saying, oh, it was always there. Maybe it was restricted if you really want to go that route. Well, you couldn't use dimensional doors before because the kingdom kept them secret. Well, that could work, I suppose, on a government conspiracy level sort of event. You could go that route. So there are ways and means that you can incorporate cool stuff after your game has started. Of course, sometimes bringing it in beforehand makes it easier. So when we talk cool stuff, you can bring almost anything from almost anywhere to anywhere else, and with a little bit of thought, as well as going through this process, you can work out how to bring it in such a way that people will kind of recognize it and go, well, I see what you did there. I know what that is. That's brilliant. That's cool. That's the reaction you want, rather than people going, yeah, okay, so it's a starship made out of wood. That's odd. You don't want that. You need to make sure that it fits within your game, that it has value for your players, characters anyway, and that it really, really, really feels as if it's part of this world and it's not just something that you're tacking on, you're slapping on. It needs to have stats, it needs to have space in which to operate, it needs to have counters, etc., etc. This really is something that once you've worked out, you can then add anything into your game. Until next time then, if you need to find players, rpgtablefinder.com is our own app that was written by our very own web goblin and has 9,000 users on it at the time of this video anyway. So if you're looking for players or for GMs, tables anywhere in the world, head along rpgtablefinder.com. It's free to use and you can find games almost anywhere in the world now. Until next time, I wish you and yours the happiest of gaming. Okay. So we're going to add in Facebook for fantasy, but it's going to be called Monster Tome, Head Tome, I think. Head Tome, yes, Head Tome. And it's a book that has pictures of everybody's heads in it in the whole world. And when you hit the like button, the book gets stronger. If you hit the subscribe button, you get more pages added to the book. And the front of the book's got this big goblin nose on it. And if you hit that goblin nose, it's like a bell, you get alerted whenever new things get added to the book. Huh? No, I didn't think so.